Thinking about founders, if someone's starting a new company and they're kind of trying to decide, do I raise investment and do I work with like a VC, or do I bootstrap, or maybe some alternative? What are the factors you think a founder should be considering when they're kind of weighing out their options?
The first thing I would tell any founder is define the problem. What is the problem you are solving? Bootstrapping is possible in some cases and just not really in others. Company that manufactures chips. I mean, your first plant costs you $10 billion. Building a data center, like anything that has a lot of capital intensity, is going to be difficult for somebody to bootstrap. So, and then there are some other questions. If who is your customer, and can the product be built at a low enough cost that you can start to ship to customers, get cash flow in, and really allow you to bootstrap? Squarespace was profitable in its first year, which is an amazing statistic in my head. And they continue to build a rapidly growing business where they just took the more or less the profits of that business and plowed it right back in. And really, what did it allow you to do, man? It allowed you to build web pages more easily. Very simple.
Welcome back to another episode of Meta Rick, where we talk about emerging technologies with business leaders. Today's guest is Jonathan Carmel, and this is going to be an interesting one. So Jonathan, he's got a degree in political science from Brown back in the day, but most of his experience, he's got a 25-year background analyzing companies. He gets what strategies and implementations have worked, where they go wrong, brings a lot of creative revenue and risk management ideas to clients through his experience at JP Morgan, Angelo Gordon, 2 hedge funds, an AI firm, and now at Impact Venture Capital. So today we're going to get a little bit more into that VC perspective of how do investors think about deep tech and emerging technologies. Jonathan, thanks for being on the show. Maybe you could start by giving us a little context for Impact Venture Capital and the type of work that you do.
Sure. Well, first, thanks for having me on. I've always had great conversations with you, and I love all that you know, and just the conversations we had in the past. So Impact is a early stage venture capital firm. We've got investments in 38 companies currently, so relatively large portfolio. We are currently funding out of our Fund 2 and in the process of trying to raise Fund 3. So that's exciting. We are, technology investors. We have focused a lot on artificial intelligence, but we also have hardware investments, and sometimes they are linked. We have a number of investments in the metaverse. I'm on board observer status on 2 of those. One is a omnidirectional treadmill company called Infinideck. Infinideck was featured in Ready Player One, was I think our biggest, allowing people to get.
Sorry to cut you off. Was that actually your product that was used in the movies?
Yes. Oh, that omnidirectional treadmill and runs and stops and turns, and it's a great experience for people. Totally immersive. Really get that feeling of walking around. One of the problems with the metaverse has been, or whatever, we can talk about that a little more, has been the lack of true immersion. So it's not cheap. It's, $50,000+ item. It's not for, just the average home user. That's not what it's being built or sold for. And then the other company that I'm a board observer on is a company called Helium. Helium combines biofeedback and XR. It can be AR, it can be VR, it could be even really flat screen technology, but they use biofeedback to change how your body feels. And that can be it's primarily EEG, which is measuring brain waves, but it is also, they can do a whole lot of other things. They can do skin conductance, they can do heart rate variability, and they then can change the media that you are seeing to elicit different bodily responses. So it can be used in a couple different ways. One, self-regulation. It's primarily used to help calm people. The assets they have internally can change color, and can change speed, can change your focus. And so one of the better things about the immersive experience is you are closed off from everything else. So very quickly, within like 4 minutes, you can get somebody to calm themselves in an effective way, because they are really training themselves and looking to see how their brain is really reacting in that case. But it has other use cases. For example, it can be used to increase focus. We've been working with NBA teams to see if we can't get, real focus, hey, I really need to concentrate on getting hyped up for the game, maybe even more specifically, things like hitting a free throw. You could see it for a soccer match, like a penalty kick, either from the goaltender, like bringing focus, getting your brain ready, like you're getting your body ready. To really, really focus, I think is interesting. And there are different EEG waves. There's alpha waves, which generally are associated with calm, but theta waves are more focus. So it's an interesting company and run by a very dynamic woman.
Yeah, well, I want to circle back into talking more about Helium and Infinidac and some of the specific kind of products you work with. But before getting into those, because I think that they're super interesting, and some of the sports use cases I know we've talked a lot about in the past of where that could go.
Yeah.
And I know I'm going to put you a little bit on the spot here, but right before we started recording, we were talking a little bit about the frame in which you look at deep tech. And we were kind of taking a look at, the metaverse, spatial computing. There's all these words floating around, and there's some people that are deep in it as like XR innovators. Some people are more like brand marketers that are just trying to get eyeballs or engage with users. There's people like me that are kind of on the biz dev side and trying to figure out how do we actually create deals around this technology? How do we implement it? But you're on the VC side. You're an investor. You're taking a look at these markets as a whole and picking out bets that you think are going to be the next big thing. And so I'd be curious to ask a little bit more of an open-ended question on just how do you look at deep tech? How do you define XR and the metaverse, and where's your focus as an investor?
Sure. So let me get away from deep tech for the moment, and I'll define the metaverse, and we can come back to deep tech.
Yeah, I just asked you like 4 questions, so appreciate you bearing with
me. Yeah, no, that was like, and so we're invested. Maybe one of our better investments is a company that is developing new chip technology that's going to greatly speed up AI training. So we call that deep tech within our mindscape. So that's something that, has nothing to do, not nothing. It has only tangential things to do with what you would call XR. In terms of like the metaverse, I like to think of them as either immersive or augmented experiences. I've read Matthew Ball's book, and I think Matthew's really smart. But he had a definition of the metaverse that ran on for like well more than a paragraph. And I'm like, it's an immersive world that stays, and you can come back to it, and you can trade things, and it's seamless, and it was this, and this. When I'm thinking about investing in these technologies, we are looking for things that I think are brand new, are interesting, but that have a use case that makes sense to people. And I will say we are not really that focused on the consumer side. So a lot of the technology for immersion, games. Obviously, this is a fantastic thing for games. Love Beat Saber, love Half Life, Alex. It's but that's not how we invest. I we think more about business to business, and there are plenty of people who do great work in the consumer VC space, but it's just not us. Um, so we're looking for use cases that make sense to us, and at least how I think about it is, what's the use case that brings real ROI, return on investment their customer, and does that make sense? And is that a decent market? Is the market itself growing? And if you can answer yes to a bunch of those questions, then it's an interesting company to put money into. Uh, there's a lot more that goes into it, but that's a really high level way I think about it.
So just to
You
recap,
know,
as a
I
as an
Sure.
investor, you're basically looking at business to business, so companies that are focused on business to business offerings that solve real pain points, like looking for pragmatic solutions to problems. I think with you called out something important that I need to get better at with my terminology is like deep tech isn't limited to spatial computing and XR. It's AI, it's Web3 with crypto, it's 3D printing, it's quantum computing. Like it's deep tech is so
I
many
generally
things.
so many things. I generally think of deep tech as having involving hardware. That may be not perfectly true, but I we look at we've gotten pitches for fusion technology. That is certainly, a fusion reactor is definitely deep tech in my mind. I don't know that like a SaaS business qualifies as deep tech in my brain.
Yeah, I think there's a definition I really liked that there's a book called Deep Tech from Eric Redmond, who was the technical innovation
Mm-hmm.
officer for Nike. He like founded the technical innovation office there. I've honestly, I'm such a fanboy. I've called this book out probably on like half the episodes of the pod. Like, I think it's something that every C-suite executive should read. It's very simplified and it's very relevant. It's not like a book that's been pitched to business leaders for the last 20 years. It's like a couple years old. So it's like very, very relevant to how business leaders should be thinking today. But the
Yep.
definition that he pulled, I think, actually comes from MIT. And it's like technology that is barely explainable or understandable today as to like what exactly it'll get used for. But tomorrow it'll be so ubiquitous that we can't imagine a world without it. And so
Hmm.
most deep tech kind of falls into that category of like we're scraping a surface of experiments, trying to figure out what it's really getting going to be successfully used for. But at some point, like the smartphone's a great example. When smartphones first came out, it was like, okay, are we just going to use this for sending emails? Like, is it we're just going to text, but for business and do it on a phone, browse the internet a little bit? We had no idea that we were going to end up with these multifaceted vending machines in our pocket where all transactions for e-commerce are happening on mobile devices and people are kind of reviewing contracts and signing contracts on mobile devices and all these really kind of advanced applications that have been built out for it. We would have never known that at the beginning, but now it's so ingrained in our lives that we can't live without it. We can't imagine a world without it. So that's usually the definition I
How,
fall back on there.
how would you define like a fusion reactor there? I mean, we know that the science behind it, right? It's the science that powers the sun.
Mm-hmm.
We know what it ultimately would be used for, which is produce a lot of electricity, and we are going to use a lot more electricity going forward. Um, so how? But we don't know how to get from the science. We can't do the engineering. Like, but we know what it's used for, and it's probably not used. Maybe it has other uses that we can't think of. But people have been trying to make controlled fusion reactions since the 50s. Um,
Yeah, that's
it's
interesting.
just
It's like we have a use case that's really well defined. We know the problem that it solves. It's just a matter of like, will it exist? When will it exist? Is it feasible for it to like can it happen? Is more the question.
yeah, it's and it's a really like hats off to the people who are trying to do this. I think it's really hard. We have not invested in it. I I think it's a problem that the engineering is a long time away from, but I could very easily be wrong.
Well, it's a
But
thing with
yeah, no, I think that the metaverse, like however you want to define XR, uh, I think probably fits in more with your iPhone idea, where we don't know all the use cases. Obviously, games are a big part, but warfare. Like I was watching a video of the war in Ukraine, and
Mhm.
they've got a guy in a bunker on the Ukrainian side flying a drone in. He's got full immersion to fly the drone, and they rig the drones with grenades and mortars, and they're very effective. And I think you know it's really going to change
the
uh,
so,
warfare.
sorry to cut off a little bit, but I like this topic,
Sure.
and I'm curious because I don't know a lot about it. Maybe you know more, but there there's like this video that went viral on Joe Rogan where they were talking about one of these. I forget exactly which helicopter, but the guy is basically dialed into a headset where his eyes, when they move, the turrets move. Like he is a part of this machine essentially. Like this headset is using eye tracking and mixed reality and all the things that we talk about with something like the
And
Apple Vision
it's
Pro,
a
right?
$400,000 headset. You know, it's awesome. I've seen those things. I've had one on.
You've tried one
I
of
mean, it
those?
wasn't. I mean, yes, because I was down at a military conference and I got an opportunity to try one. It wasn't fitted for me, like for real combat, and especially like for the F-35. So they wear. I mean, you basically don't need anymore. They still have all of the altimeter and speedometer and all of the dials and gauges, but you don't really need them anymore, right? It's all can all be in the headset. And yes, they do eye tracking, and when you turn your head, the gun for which is one of the helicopters, the attack helicopters. The gun follows where you look. So all the pilot has to do is look and press the fire button, and it'll fire right to where he is looking, which is pretty amazing technology. It is hyper specialized.
You know, it's interesting because when I looked at that use case and when I hear you talk about it, it's like I think about the big hesitation everyone has with something like the Vision Pro or even like the Varjos is that in industrial work, where there's like safety concerns, like it's really safe to use for training, and we'll get into those use cases in a second because I know you've had a lot of research into hard skills training. But when it
Yep.
comes to doing real work where they've got this digital layer over the top of the physical experience, like a lot of these digital twins will have like basically a digital twin of all of the piping in a building, and someone can walk around with an iPad and scan and see the digital piping through the walls. And like there's these really incredible use cases
Yeah.
for doing real work in real time using mixed reality and augmented reality. But the big hesitation to it is like operating machinery with any lag whatsoever, with the risk of a headset going down on you or something like that. Like it creates this risk of danger. But once you get to that caliber of a $400,000 headset, like it's obviously technically possible to get the lag down enough to where they can use it, right?
Well, so some of these very expensive headsets for the military are, I would say they are more pass. They're not pass through. They're more heads up.
Mm-hmm.
So they're probably the most. It so the pilots can still see um, out and can see that the light beams come through the helmet from the outside world, but they can project on top of it all of the uh, flight parameters, for example, all of the targeting, the status, and they can project some really cool things like for the F-35, there are cameras mounted around. So the pilot can flip a switch and through a camera look directly down below him, which obviously you can't do, right? I mean, the plane is like literally below you, but you can look down. So they do have effectively less than pass through on the new F-35. Um, for the military, incredibly, advanced. So look, the military is an interesting person to sell into because they care about things in a very different way, but they don't care about the return on investment nearly as much. Can it do what we need it to do? And price tag is often secondary. Very
That's
difficult.
Yeah, that's really valid. I think that one of the things I've noticed with these like military use cases is like they have unique challenges they have to solve for. I've heard of some where they're doing training where it's like coming around the corner of a building, and then you've got to be able to read a situation and where you shoot, and bomb squad like figuring out what type of bomb a terrorist is making in a certain scenario. And the level of perfection to detail is so different that I think most of those are very a la carte, very customized, and like really, really expensive programs. But with enterprise use cases, like when you take away from military and start thinking about B2B, I know your specialties like healthcare and fintech is kind of the biggest categories. Would you say the biggest issue is like scalability, like finding a way to take an idea and like making it cost effective enough, pragmatic enough to actually use it on an ongoing basis? Because I see all of these POCs, all of these experiments, but it's not
Yep.
all of those experiments that go viral or get a lot of PR end up getting used after that experiment was done.
So I think there has to be, for enterprise sales, there has to be a valid reason, and not just a modestly better reason, but a really truly better reason uh, to for them to do something and spend money on something. Uh, so, you know, we've been looking at use cases within the metaverse for things like how to high consequence, low probability events make a lot of sense very easily. People need almost muscle memory. So if you thought, like, I'll start with the military and then I'll take it somewhere else. Um, so, the military, lots of use cases where you wear some sort of, they can create a scenario for training. It can be virtual reality, it can be mixed reality, where, hey, we want to practice storming a building. You know, I need to know where I'm going. Look, when they attacked bin Laden in 2011, they rebuilt that house as best they understood so that those SEAL teams would have almost the muscle memory and just be able to keep moving as quickly as they could. They needed very low reaction time and very, have a great sense to the degree possible of what to do. And I think these realities allow for like the military to do that. Then let's take that to, let's say, the next thing. Look at what Axon, which is the company formerly known as Taser, they think that the virtual reality training, and you can go on their investor relations website, they think it's growing roughly 50% a year, is their estimation. And so I can really understand that. These events where you're trying to teach somebody how to deal with a shooter. So then, we've seen events that start to scale down, but not that much from it. For example, like Verizon takes headsets around to all of their retail outlets to teach people how to deal with robberies. I mean, you really need to know what to do in those 20 or 30 seconds that it's going on, and how to keep yourself safe. Now, you're not attacking bin Laden. You're like, okay, somebody came into my Verizon store with a gun. So how do I keep myself safe? How do I keep my customers safe? And the immersion and making it real really can help people like that. Then we're going to take it even, and this is where things are going, but they're not completely there yet. Like, what are other high pressure situations? And some of them are like, how do you talk to somebody about a difficult conversation? And how do I do that over and over in a way that I can practice without having somebody there? And you can start to think about like conversations about, DEI or somebody being mistreated at work can be a very pressure filled thing, and training a manager how to deal with that would certainly help a lot of managers out. And then you get into a lot of the manufacturing. How do we make sure that this all works together? How do we plan things out? Digital collaboration. So I don't. That kind of went a long way from Bin Laden to digital collaboration, but
Well, I love the reference though, because I haven't thought about that in a long time. But I also heard that story about the recreation of the room in order to reduce response time, where people can basically go in and just
right.
have that muscle memory, just react, move, move, move. Because any split second decision that stalls out creates massive risk to success of that particular mission. The stakes are like ultimately high, right? For a
Yeah.
retail
And for
store, an active shooter training is really difficult to do without something like that, because what if your store is operating all the time? Like, are you going to bring your employees in
yeah,
the middle of the night and like try and do that same training every single night for a week or something like that? That doesn't seem very reasonable. So having a virtual environment to make that experience more accessible, less dangerous, and whether it's soft skills or hard skills, what I'm hearing from you is this increase in repetitions is where the ROI comes from, is like being able to give people more attempts.
yeah, and recreate something, generally something that is, you and I've talked a bit about Jeremy Bailenson and the work he's done out at the Stanford Computer Human Interaction Lab. And events, things that are like dangerous or expensive, you know. And he's got an acronym, and I always screw it up, but it's DICE. And dangerous and expensive are two of them. Inconceivable, like, you know, it's that those are the times where I think virtual reality can really be incredibly impressive. So, I've spoken to Coke Industries, right? They've got tons of chemical plants all around the country, and they use it for fire extinguisher training because it you can really save your entire plant if you can get to that fire quickly, and how to deal with a fire and control your emotions in those very few seconds. It's not just reaction time, it's clear headedness in my way of thinking. And if it's unusual, people tend not to be clear headed. If hey, I've been here before and it's going to be okay is your body's natural reaction, then and to really make it seem real, you really need something that immerses somebody.
Yeah, and I think there's
So
a big misconception with this topic sometimes, where when people hear about simulated experiences, they start to think that it's a replacement for the real experience. And it's not a replacement, it's an augment, right? So, like, for example, if you have a welder, you want them to actually weld something at some point before they go weld things
yeah,
professionally. That still needs to happen. But if you could reduce it to where they only need 1 week of real welding, and then the other three weeks or 3 months can be virtual welding to prepare them, you just made it so much more accessible for people that never could have afforded to even try it in the first place, to test out that career path and get access to it. And you made it so much more affordable to train on board and get them to a place where they could do the physical training in the real world scenario. So I always like to remind people of that it's not like a full on replacement. It's something that modifies and just makes it more scalable. What one thing
I mean,
sorry, one thing I'm curious about is, like, I have a lot of business leaders that buy these sort of software or agency vendors to onboard them into these experiences. But your perspective is going to be a little different because you're not vetting and buying the vendors, you're investing in the vendors that provide those services. So when you think of what is a good, like, what are the measurements of success to you when you're thinking of this is a startup that seems like a worthwhile investment for me?
hmm. Well, it usually starts with the team. So, do I believe in the team? Do they have the experience? Especially the founder. Some of the time that we're investing in really small teams, just a couple of people. They have a good experience. They've got experience in the fields. They think about this correctly, and then we look at product. does the product solve a uniquely solve a problem? So what's the problem that you're solving? And then how big is that market? And what's happening to that market? Is that market growing? Is that market shrinking? Is it stable? How competitive is the market? So are there a lot of people trying to solve this problem and you're just one? And sometimes the answer is yes. We think that we've got the best solution to the problem for a variety of reasons. But we tend to like markets that we have less competition, or we don't see many people out there. They're doing something kind of unique. I mean, what Infinidec does, I think, is really, really is really unique. There's really there are other omnidirectional treadmills, but they don't work on the same technique at all. Ours is really, truly the only active, but what I mean by that is as you move, the device reacts to you. Other ones that work and are cheaper, to be perfectly honest, but their use cases are very different. Is they basically have a giant dish. You put basically some kind of slippery shoes on, and then you can walk, but it doesn't feel the same.
Yeah,
It feels very.
There's that one that was on Shark Tank, and Mark Cuban invested in them. I think it's called like Omni or something. But they feel like they're more
Yes.
geared towards almost like gaming. Like they do like pop-ups for events, and like they try and fit it like, I think they compared it to like a Peloton, where like a consumer could fit it in their house with the same space as a Peloton or something like that.
Sure. And we know those guys and we like them, and they're going after a consumer market, and we are not. We have a very
Totally
different,
use cases. Yeah, like not even remotely
totally different use.
comparable.
They we have a lot of respect for them, but just a very different market. They're coming out, with the new Omni shortly. Jan Good, he's American, but he has a Dutch last name. Gutlek. I'm sorry, Jan. I'm sure I screwed that up, but we have a lot of respect for them.
And I can't do any better.
Yeah, no, it's. I think anything, and the games are more fun if they're truly immersive. I've been to, Sandbox and Zero Latency, and they're really fun and a very different feeling, right? That like, hey, I'm traveling through, but to some degree, these box location based entertainment systems, they're expensive. It's $30. It's $1 a minute basically per person. So I took one of my daughters to Sandbox here. It's not far from us in New Jersey, and it was a great experience. We had a really fun time, but it's not a cheap experience.
I just tried Zero Latency for the first time last week, actually, in Houston. It was pretty cool. Like, it was an interesting approach. I was surprised by how much we could walk around the space with how limited the environment was. But I want to get back into Infinidec real quick, because I think this is a good specific example, and there might be things you can and can't share. I'll let you kind of make that call, but I think it's a good kind of case study. So, like, as an investor, when you're talking to Infinidec, like, how did that conversation start? Like, did they find you, or did you find them? And kind of, could you walk through as much of the process as you're willing to on how that went?
Sure. I'll be perfectly honest. I wasn't around when that investment was made. So I joined Impact almost 2 years ago now, and that investment predated me. So I really can't. I can tell you how I conceptually think about that company. I wasn't there, so I don't want to put words in people's mouths. They have a unique product that nobody else has, and it's protected by patents. And these things are being used for research, for training, and for healthcare primarily now. So the training things, Dow Chemical has them. Again, can we teach people how to deal with a problem inside our plant? And they need to be able to get somewhere in a certain amount of time. And that can all be done through an Infinidex. So it gives people, again, this muscle memory of how to get through a plant, and where things are going. We for healthcare, we have a partner named Chimea. They have a product out there, and it's for lower body rehabilitation. One of the ways I ended up in VR immersive was through a company called Penumbra, which has an immersive healthcare division, and I got interested in it. Tried to figure out, like, seems out there. It's Penumbra does mostly thrombectomy, but they do have something called the Real System out there, and they do a lot of they do either at home or in hospital rehab. But if you really want to think about like lower body rehab, you really kind of need to be able to walk. That's an important part of it, and the Infinideck can be used in a variety of ways. Rehab is definitely one of them. We can, at the Cleveland Clinic, they've got machines there. They analyze people's gait as they make them walk through what is a virtual grocery store. So it's very controlled, and they can tell from people's gaits and how their feet fall on the platform as they are walking whether or not they have early stages of Parkinson's. So it's a very accurate, very early stage for a degenerative nerve disease, and that's somewhat experimental, but that would be a great diagnostic tool for people.
That's such an interesting use case. I don't think that's something most people would think of. I think when they think of the omnidirectional treadmills and stuff, the Ready Player Me thing, or sorry, the Ready Player One, not the Avatar app movie. I think that's like the first thing people think of is all the exciting like gamification of it. But when you told me about this, I think in one of our first conversations, maybe like a year or two ago, you mentioned that you use it for rehabilitation. You can do these diagnoses. And it got me thinking that there's this kind of under talked about piece of XR. Like a lot of what we talk about is the experience that users end up having, like the ability to engage employees and train them, or engage customers and sell things to them. But there's this other piece of XR that's not just the experience, it's also the data. Like the type of data you can collect in a 3D environment, or on an omnidirectional treadmill is completely different than the data that we're already tracking in a 2D screen that people are clicking and interacting with. And so I was curious if that was part of, I mean, we don't necessarily need to keep it to Infinideck, but I'm curious about your thoughts on that. Like what are some of the things with 3D data that interest you, or is that something you've started exploring much?
Yeah, no, we've thought a lot in this age of AI about what kind of moats are there around an AI business. And one of the things that struck me, so I switched this week from ChatGPT 4, which I was using, to Claude 3. And I just canceled one and paid my $20 per month to the other. And the outputs, look, the outputs for ChatGPT 4, for GPT-4 were great, but Claude is better now. And I think it'll keep switching back and forth as they refine the algorithms. But I also think it means that there's a race to the bottom in that business. Look, Microsoft has put $10 billion or something stupid into OpenAI. I mean, Claude hasn't got, Anthropic, hasn't gotten nearly that funding, but their funding is in the billions. These huge foundational models, LLMs, are extremely expensive to first train and then run inference on. And I wonder how they're going to be able to maintain pricing, because if I can switch easily from A to B, and it's hard to tell, if I put a prompt in here and it comes out here and it's basically the same coming out of both, how do I tell that your product is really unique, and why is that not just almost a commodity. Uh, so we've been trying to think about moats and where how do you develop a moat in the age of AI? And one of the things that we've been playing with, and I can't say this is, we have not proven this to ourselves, but logically it makes sense to me. I'm not sure, there may be holes in it, is that unique data generates unique insight. And so how do you get unique data? So these LLMs are trained more or less on the internet. I mean, massive amounts of data. Some of it's copyrighted, which might be a problem down the road. We don't know. The courts will figure that out. Some of which, there are models being built on just open source. Maybe they'll catch up at some point. They just don't have as many parameters. But how do you get unique data? And so, there isn't as much digital data about the 3D world as there is on the, flat world. Look, we've been printing books since Gutenberg, and there's been writing back, 5 millennia or something like that. So you've got sort of linear flat, and then you've got a lot in. You've got a decent amount of audio and probably somewhat less in video, but a lot in video. And then you've got the 3D world, and digitizing the 3D world has a lot less data around it. So capturing that for specific use cases could be wildly interesting as a data. So the next the next control system for Infinitec is actually going to have 4 cameras and recreate the body moving on it in 3D space. That will capture a lot of data. And at one, we're doing it because it's a more effective control system. And we're going to be able to tell how people walk a little differently. What the use of that data isn't as clear to me at this moment. But I do think, if we can use that data for diagnosis, right, the way the Cleveland Clinic is using it, if we can tell that everybody, has a certain hip swing or a certain, movement of their shoulder, that could be really helpful in early diagnosis of a lot of different, neurological diseases, osteopathic diseases. We don't know. I can give you one of our more recent examples, and this is more AI, is a company called Grow Guru. They have a sensor. You bury it underground if you're a farmer, and it samples the soil, it checks for moisture and nutrients and so forth, and then sends that signal back. That signal, is then processed, mixed with other data like from the USDA and weather data, to tell you exactly how much, if you're a farmer, how much to water, how much to fertilize, etc. So the data, what they're really selling in my brain is insight, telling the farmer this is what to do to get the best yield, but what they're nominally selling is a device, and the device itself, I think, is somewhat less important than the fact that they're really selling insight.
It's for sure a moat, and I think it helps solve a problem that a lot of companies in the XR industry are dealing with. And I like that you focused on the AI examples, because I think there's a ton of overlap. This is a great example of AI and metaverse not being competitive technologies. They actually overlap very, very closely with how AI can help scale generating content, help analyze the data. Like, there's so many ways that AI is essential as a feature of XR. And I think for most industries, AI is a feature of those industries, not necessarily a full-on replacement or competitive technology. But one of the things that I was thinking about is that it's really hard sometimes for XR companies to quantify their value. Because when you're talking about training, when you're talking about collaboration, when you're talking about a lot of these use cases, they're not revenue generating use cases. It's a lot easier to prove ROI when you say, if you buy this tech, you're going to make X more sales, or you're going to sell deals at a higher conversion rate. Like, that's something that's easy for companies to say, great, if I put $1 in, I'll get $10 out. Awesome. I'm going to do that. That's a no-brainer. But when it comes to training use cases, collaboration, it's more cost reduction or time savings, which is a little harder sometimes. And I heard a talk at Industrial Immersive where they were talking about how we're making a mistake with immersive training, where we're using the same data points as LMS systems. How long did someone train for? And what's the completion rate of the training? And that's a huge missed opportunity because you're basically just tracking the same 2D data points that you've always tracked, when in reality, you could start tracking way more about the three-dimensional space of like when someone interacts in this way versus that way. Do they retain the information better, or do they perform better? And I don't think anyone's set a playbook for that yet. But I'm curious if there's any types of spatial data that you have a hypothesis about, or you've started to see kind of make a difference.
And I have to say I disagree slightly. Like, yeah, they may not be revenue generating, but if I can reduce my training time, my training cost, then that still impacts the bottom line. $1 saved is like $1 earned. I mean, it still impacts the bottom line. Yes, I understand. So people care. It doesn't help you if you're a multiple of revenue business, but if you're a multiple of earnings business, it does. A lot of bigger businesses care just as much of cost reduction as increasing revenue. So onboarding, go talk to Walmart. They onboard hundreds of thousands of people a year. And if they can just cut a little bit out of training time, that's really effective. We haven't seen many immersive products that really help grow the top line tremendously. In the healthcare space, there are definitely, the ROIs look a little bit different, right? And here you can start to see some really great data come out. So, if you're doing rehab, you can get much more accurate data than any physical therapist can ever tell you with camera tracking, or like Penumbra uses actual body tracking technology. If I can lift my shoulder to, 45 degrees, and then, you're trying to get it to 90. If I can get from 45, but I've got a shoulder injury, if I can get it from 45 to 50, that's impressive. But I need to keep pushing on it. So gamifying and then combining it with immersion can be very effective. So, like Penumbra's technology, you're reaching out and you're trying to grab a bird, let's say, and it's, so you reach out and you grab the bird, but they'll make it just hard enough for you. So it's reacting to how much your shoulder is moving, and it will start to make you fail in order for you to push harder. And you are going to push harder for a couple of reasons. One, there's some component of distraction technology. Distractive therapy is known to work. If you look at like Applied VR, they do distraction to help reduce the amount of anesthesia that somebody needs during surgery, which helps in a lot of ways. Anesthesia itself is really it is a really tough component of surgery. So if I can just use less of it, that's a benefit to the patient. There's less danger, etc. So some of what like Penumbra will do is, as you're reaching out, you're reaching higher and higher, and you're pushing yourself, but you're not noticing like it's painful. And that can be, they are looking exactly where you are moving your arms in space, and having the 3D asset change based on your own body movement. So there is some degree of biofeedback in that. And that itself is really important. And you can see, and the other thing that will start to happen is that we will take that data across people, and we will know what, once the data sets get big enough, what therapies work best, who should be using them, under what conditions, versus each therapist having going through a training and in physical therapy school, and then using it with their own set of patients. We can now have a data set that we will put more or less either machine learning or more advanced forms of AI on top of, so that we can get people better faster in physical therapy.
I love that example for a few
So
reasons. One is the tie into the spatial data, like the spatial feedback of like how far your shoulder's actually moving, how your physical behavior changes throughout the rehabilitation process will change the way the simulation responds and kind of makes you do the work. And I love that because that's something that you can't do by watching a video. Like watching a video doesn't do that.
no,
The only alternative is to physically have a rehabilitation officer with you in a dedicated environment and like recreating that physically, which is expensive, requires a certain amount of space. There's like a lot of added friction versus the virtual simulation
and it's
when
not much fun.
there's another opportunity. And then to your point about distraction, that's real, right? Like think about everyone who's afraid of needles. Like we've all been told since we were 3 years old, look to the side, you won't even notice it happens, right? There's like these little things that can really help. Now I've put you on the
Totally.
spot and gotten really tactical in some of the XR weeds throughout this conversation, but I want to pivot back into more of an investor question. So when
Okay.
thinking about founders, if someone's starting a new company and they're kind of trying to decide, do I raise investment and do I work with like a VC, or do I bootstrap, or maybe some alternative? What are the factors you think a founder should be considering when they're kind of weighing out their options?
The first thing I would tell any founder is define the problem. What is the problem you are solving? And there will be pivots in your product, no doubt. And so sometimes like the use cases change, but if you can define the problem, uh, that will, one, help you clarify all of your ideas around product. Two, you know, different bootstrapping is possible in some cases and just not really in others. Capital intensity is obviously it changes by industry. I mean, there are some wildly. It's really hard to start a new uh, company that manufactures chips. I mean, your first plant costs you $10 billion. Building a data center, like anything that has a lot of capital intensity, is going to be difficult for somebody to bootstrap. Uh, so, and then there are some other questions. If Who is your customer, and can the product be built at a low enough cost um, that you can start to ship to customers, get cash flow in, and really allow you to bootstrap. Um, you know, Squarespace was profitable in its first year, which is an amazing statistic in my head. Like, and they continue to build a rapidly growing business where they just took the more or less the profits of that business and plowed it right back in. Just and really, what did it allow you to do? Man, it allowed you to build web pages more easily. Very simplistic, but understood their problem, that it's too hard for people to build a web page. We're going to make it easier. We're going to make it easier for small businesses to do this and to do it effectively. And we're going to give them all the tools that they need, especially connecting them to payment systems. And then they just took off from there and added more features and did more advertising. And so they were, they did get outside capital, but they were able to bootstrap to a very large extent. So, how difficult is your product to build? Uh, and who are you selling it to? I mean, they didn't have to be a complete feature company for the first customers they had. They were selling to mom and pop. And if they could just make it easier, like, hey, I'm I don't know, selling candles on the internet, right? It's got to have pictures of my candles, give you an idea of the scent, connect to a payment system, and hopefully at some point connect to my inventory management system, so I know what's in stock and what's not. And then they kept adding features. Then we're going to help you with the shipping, and then so. But if you're going to try and build something for a big enterprise, you got to have the product around. And sometimes people pivot into a product. Hey, and Squarespace started with small, and now I'm sure they're selling to multi-billion-dollar corporations.
So when thinking about these
so I don't. That may not have answered your question exactly, because I think it's a very open-ended question, and the answer is it depends.
No, I think it is a great answer. Basically, what my takeaway from that is there's these kind of two categories. One category is like a startup that has very low startup cost to create a proof of concept, like an MVP, get first users. That's bootstrappable in the first place. But there's a category of business that's just straight up not bootstrappable unless you already have a lot of capital yourself that you've made from whatever previous experience or whatever you have. But I want
to create a new airline or new aircraft.
Yeah, like
in a bootstrap way.
I think hardware specifically is really hard to bootstrap. But and that's why I really admire hardware founders, by the way, like people that try to attack those problems. Like that is a big undertaking to try and go and attack. And it's usually a long time before you start generating that first bit of revenue. I think there's two things. One, I want to touch on the bootstrappable businesses. I think something big has changed in the last 10 to 20 years where we kind of moved from this move fast and break things to now there's just so many tools to help enable a founder to build like a simple SaaS tool that the expectation has gone way up for like what makes a good tool. So now I think there's a lot of access for someone to go in and like build something quickly. But usually I think if you want to raise money for like a SaaS product, I imagine like you need to show some real traction of like, I actually have users, I've actually gone down this path. Because it is so accessible to bootstrap, I imagine as an investor, your expectations by the time they get to you for more capital is probably a lot higher, right?
Yes and no. Look, there are a lot of problems out there, and if you can uniquely solve a problem, then and you can show me what that problem is and explain why you can uniquely solve it, then you don't really, we'll invest in, and why you're qualified to build that. So, there are tons of different approaches to cybersecurity, for example. And this is a category where cybersecurity risk is not going away. Or, if somebody came to me with a unique, I saw something called Nightshade, which I didn't invest in this, but seemed like a cool idea. And it basically was you took any image or any moving image, and Nightshade actually corrupted the image for LLMs. So they could not be used. It's a way of protecting your imaging. So you could have the image out there in a digital format, but not readable by the LLMs, which I thought was kind of an interesting, so I can like really, really protect something that is mine in a unique way. That I think is an idea. That kind of idea to me is something that could get funding without much traction at all.
It's just like
I just thought
it's like a compelling.
It's a unique idea. And it's a real problem.
Yeah, it's a compelling enough idea with a really relevant and big problem. One follow-up question on that. So like, let's say someone fits into that category where whether it's SaaS or hardware, it doesn't matter, but they've got something where they have a compelling story it's venture size, like it's scalable enough to where it's worth a venture investment to build it. You got no users, you got no prototype, you can't afford to make a prototype, you need money to do it. What's the way that someone can stand out to you? Is it just the way in which they tell their story? Is it pitch decks? Do they make little video clips? Like how do people stand out
Oh,
today in this oversaturated entrepreneurship market?
excellent question. You know, and maybe I'm just old, but I think it's network. It's get to the right people, and really use your network and get to places where you could find capital that matches up. And there are better and better tools to help you network. I mean, like everybody's got LinkedIn, but if you're a young business looking for investment capital, then first of all, go to the people who are relevant. So that means like pitch to pitch to somebody who knows something in that field. So generally, you got people who specialize in a particular subject, and so go to them, and they'll be able to, one. If you've got a unique idea, then they will help fund it. Um, and there are obviously different stages within venture, pre-seed, seed, A, blah, 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 and they all get kind of mixed together, and there's no definition of what's what and when, and people do all sorts of crazy ideas about when, but I think it's got to me, go to the right people and network. That's what you're looking for. And persistence. I mean, one of the things that you got to have as a founder is persistence and belief in yourself, 100%, and your team. Uh, you have to believe in your product. You have to believe in yourself. And the founders that I see have success, they'll just keep going. They just don't stop. And they work hard and they believe, and like, some of my favorite entrepreneurs, like literally, I'll email some of our portfolio companies. I get an answer back immediately. I'm like, how do you're really, there's a reason that a lot of entrepreneurs are young. It takes a lot of energy. It really does. And it takes a lot of belief in yourself and a little bit of almost not knowing it's impossible, uh, which is kind of a weird statement, but just like, I'm going to make it work, and I'm going to kill it, and I will take no and no and no and no and no and keep going, and eventually I'll get to a yes. So, I don't know if I answered your question exactly, but
No, you for sure did. I think there's a couple things that stand out. One is relevance over personalization. I think that's become a growing topic in go-to-market and sales, and I think pitching investors is very similar to pitching customers. Like there's a lot of overlap.
100%.
It's just a different
Completely.
positioning essentially, but relevance is key. Like finding the targeting of the right type of investor, getting introduced, finding a way to start the conversation is so much more important than creating some spectacular like slide deck presentation that's going to blow their socks off. Like just knowing the right story and telling that story to the right person is like ultimately what it comes down to.
Most pitch decks, I don't think people read past the first two pages.
Yeah.
I really doubt it. I mean, look, uh, the way it works is, we see an idea, or more importantly, we see a founder that we really like, and all of a sudden, and you better have an elevator pitch. What's the problem? Why? How do I solve it? And if I can believe those two things in the first 60 seconds are the most important. And then you go from there. Like, I actually will read a pitch deck of somebody that, I've met. And even more importantly, somebody has already come with some sort of seal of approval. We get it through another VC, we're always going to read that pitch deck. It comes in over the transom. We read a lot of those, but not all of them.
In sales,
And I can tell you,
we call it social proof, right? Like there's some credibility
right,
that comes with
exactly.
that. Yeah. So one other question, because I know we're kind of coming up a little bit over time here. So I've got one other question for you, and that's I've had another investor on the show before that's more of an angel investor, and one of the things we kind of wrapped up with that I really liked was this idea of like a call for entrepreneurs. Like if there is a particular gap you see that you're looking to solve a certain type of problem in the market, or there's a certain type of company you're really curious to meet with and maybe invest in, what type of entrepreneurs should think about reaching out to you? Like which ones do you want to meet with?
If you think you've got unique data and you've got a moat around your data, we'll figure out how to make something great out of it. I'm a huge believer in data is the new oil. And it's not perfectly true, because like oil can only be burned once and data can be used again and again and again. But if you've got a reason to believe that your data is truly unique, and it probably exists in a relatively narrow vertical, I think that is a business probably worth taking a look at. I have a couple other examples of unique data businesses, but I think if you can solve a problem and generate unique data, you've got some winning characteristics.
As you describe that, what I picture in my head, just because it's been coming up for me a lot, is the Salesforce commercial. I think it's Salesforce. I hope it's Salesforce. Otherwise, I'm messing up their marketing. But it's Matthew McConaughey talking about how like data's the new gold, and he's like walking around in the old west. It's like a gold rush vibe. But there's like a very specific visual I have in my head when you start talking about that. Now, last thing is that.
But if you and I have the same data, it's got to be unique.
Yeah, well, that's why I like that you touches like a moat, right? Like it has to be either for like a niche industry, a niche type of person. There's also, sorry, I am trying to wrap up soon, but this just sparked another idea. Is like there's so much data, right? Like we have these massive data warehouses like Snowflake and Teradata and all these companies that help us store massive amounts of data. So much so that we're putting these data centers in the ocean to try and cool them down because they're so hot, and there's sustainability issues with them and all sorts of things. There's so much data. But the curation of that data, pulling the right insights from that data, finding what you're looking for from that data, that seems like an interesting opportunity, right? Like search engines sort of do that, like with Google, these LLMs kind of do that. But do you think there's something there with like the idea of
those LLMs definitely
pulling data? Yeah, that seems like the big thing that they're doing, right?
I mean, AI allows for, humans can match patterns on a small scale, right? If I give you a 10 by 10 matrix and fill in a bunch of dots, you'd be able to sort of tell, which side of the dots mostly fall on. When I start to do that on a more massive scale, 1,000,000 by 1,000,000, and even more massive than that, 1,000,000 by 1,000,000 is, a cube, and then it starts to be multi-dimensional. Like if you wanted to think about the fourth dimension as, okay, you got a cube, that's 3D. Now you have multiple cubes, that's 4D. But now you got cubes, universes of all of those cubes. You start to get into multi-dimensional. And it turns out that AI can actually handle that. It may take more training. But drawing, I'm not as concerned about the ability to get valuable patterns out of the data, even though it's unstructured. I think that's one of the things that AI is. That's what AI really does in my mind.
Have you ever heard of a Zettelkasten?
No, I can't say I've heard of Zettelkasten.
I don't know enough
What
about
is
it to
that?
give a great explanation right now. I'll send you the words so you can do a little of your own research on it. But
Okay.
my buddy that I really respect, recently we were grabbing some cocktails and he started talking to me about Zettelkasten, and he's been diving deep into this. Basically, it's a note taking kind of technique where you correlate notes together, because the way that our human memory works, right, is it's not chronological, it's like associative. So like this conversation, like there's a mic
Yeah.
in front of me and I see this NFT poster in the background and I'm sipping a yerba mate, and like those are the things that make me remember the moment, is like all the stuff that's happening around is associated together. Great book, Moonwalking with Einstein, that dives really deep into that sort of thing. But a
Huh.
Zettelkasten,
Okay.
basically, you, as you're taking notes on these different ideas that you have, or books that you've read, or all these sort of things that make up your memories, you start to correlate them together, and then it ends up creating this like web of thoughts that essentially make up what you are, like everything that's in your head. And so my buddy showed this to me, and again, like I'm not an expert in it, so that's probably not the best explanation, but he showed me a visual of it, and I had two thoughts. One, I was like, this kind of works similar to how an LLM is different than a keyword search. So it's like kind of
Mm-hmm.
mirroring that. And then the second thing is like, whoa, you just showed me your brain. Like when you showed me all of these floating thoughts and how they're all connected together, I'm like, that is like a visual interpretation of what your mind is. And I'm like, that's really, really cool. So I don't know enough about it, but it's like, I feel like you would be really into that rabbit hole if you wanted to dive into it.
I'm sure. I mean, I think one of the big questions that we will maybe answer, and I'm not even sure, is like, what is consciousness? Like, if we're ever going to like do these LLMs start to have consciousness, and then but you have to add, like, define consciousness. It's and then what's going to be really interesting is we know that like the brain is just this collection of neurons, and but yet there's this feeling that like almost like there's this, what are you? I mean, we can get very philosophical here very quickly, but like what what defines Rick, right? Like how it is that there's this little person inside your brain, like sometimes you definitely feel like that, and that's sort of really you, and but you are just this collection of neurons, this body, and yet that somehow generates consciousness, and in these things are called neural networks, and can we generate machine consciousness? And I don't I don't know the answer to that. I mean, if you took these LLMs and took them back 10 or certainly 20 years and asked if they passed the Turing test, 100% they'd say yes. Um, but our expectations about what these things can do keeps changing, because like we get very used to like, oh yeah, hey, it can do search, that's a 25-year-old trick. Um,
Well, I love this
but
quote I keep hearing when people are reviewing like Apple Vision Pro or OpenAI Sora's announcement. We need to remind ourselves, like when OpenAI shows those Sora videos, and they're just so incredible, but then you can pick out tiny little flaws or whatever. This is the worst it will ever be. Like that version that we're seeing right
yeah,
now is the worst version that they will ever produce of that technology. That's wild to think about. And lately, my example I've been showing everyone is like the Will Smith video from a year ago versus what it looks like now, and the spaghetti thing. And it's just
yep.
mind boggling that that's a 1 year difference. As you talk about like what it makes a human, like, I mean, this is kind of getting really philosophical, but my number one book, like favorite book that I recommend everyone, is Marcus Aurelius Meditations. What I love about Marcus Aurelius Meditations, I'm not sure how familiar you are with the Stoics and whatnot, but
100% no, Marcus Aurelius. Like, just it's notes about.
I mean, he's the most powerful man in the world of that era, more powerful than any
Yep.
world leader could be today. Like Rome, just at the scale of control that they had back then, was totally different than what any government has today. And the fact that he was just scribbling these ideas to himself, like this is basically his self-talk that we've now
Yep.
translated and recreated. It's the closest thing to getting inside the head of this world leader from back then and being able to revisit who he was. That's what got me so obsessed with that book. It's why I reread it all the time. It's one of my go-tos when I'm feeling unproductive or like I need to get back into a flow, as I reread some notes from that book, or his journal, right? Never meant to be published, just his own scribbles. But we're talking about data and how three-dimensional data and LLMs and all these things change, right? Like that book is scribbled down notes. That's what it is. It's a 2D set of data. But if we can start to collect other data through video clips and, you know, spatial of how someone walks and moves around and facial expressions and how they sound and their tone of voice, their level of empathy, like there's all these other data points now that make up what a person really is. Where today's version of Marcus Aurelius, when 1,000 years from now, someone revisits their journals and who they are, they're going to be able to just have a full-on conversation with that person. And that's truly magical. It's like what Steve Jobs talked about way back when, where he's like, if I could just talk to Aristotle and have Aristotle be my tutor, I think I would enjoy that very much. Right. Like that's always what I end up thinking about.
It'll be really interesting to see how this all develops. I'd love to see if anybody is working on, I mean, we know that there are a lot of companies working on, you know, generative AI in spatial computing. I think it's going to take a little while because of the lack of training data. There just isn't that much high quality 3D images to train on for these LLMs. So I think it's going to have to be algorithmic. And then what's really going to be interesting is if you and I are in the same world, looking at the same object from two different points of view, then everything has to sort of be right. And I think that's going to take both a lot of these base LLMs plus new algorithms, because we don't have the data to do that. And it has to be calculated, for example, like shadows, right? I mean, like, so you've got an item, and let's say I pick it up and I turn it around and you're looking at it too. It looks different for me than it looks for you. And the shadow looks slightly different for me and for you. And they have to be synchronous.
We still haven't had
we
you.
Don't have a lot.
We still haven't had you in Arthur yet. We gotta get you in Arthur soon. So this is a feature we actually just launched our first version of co-location recently. And it's exactly what you're talking about, where two users in the same room could have an AR object locked in with the spatial data from like a MetaQuest 3, for example, and then be able to rotate the object and it'll look the same for everyone in the room, whether they're physically in the room with a headset or they're in virtually from somewhere else. It's really, really cool. Now it's the first version of it.
Is that generatively? Or is it a programmed object?
I think the latter. I'm not technical enough to give a good answer, but basically, if you're in full VR, you would experience that object. If I move it, you'll see it move in the same way. But it basically gives that same effect, but with a pass-through of the room around you.
That's pretty awesome, man. I would love to get in here.
It's really cool. We'll do it eventually. Anyways, we could probably do a whole other conversation just dedicated to AI and
I'm sure we could just keep ripping.
Yeah, it's like this is the stuff that I have late night beers and we'll talk for 5 hours about, you know, like it's the best. But
next time we'll have a beer together.
Yeah, definitely. But anyways, as we wrap up, is there anything you want to plug? Like where can people find you? Anything that you want to publicize?
ImpactVC.com. You know, if you want to I'm available on LinkedIn. I'm not a power user, but I do use it occasionally. And you can find me on the Impact website, which is just impactvc.com, are the two best ways to get in touch with me, you know. And I would say if you're a budding entrepreneur, use your network. Just network. Figure out, you know, if like you said, social proof. I'm going to read a pitch deck that you say, hey, take a look at this. Great, I'm doing it. But if it just comes in via my email, you know, I probably get 20 to 30 of those a day. It's very hard to drink from that fire hose.
I just want to double down on that.
And I'm sure we miss great companies.
I want to double down on that advice because there's a lot of people out there looking for jobs right now too. And every single recruiter and hiring manager I've talked to, they get 400 applications within an hour of putting those job listings up. Applications cold just do not work. Like same thing, network. Who do you know? Who can set up an intro? Who trusts you? And that's the name of the game for everybody. If you're in college, going to those recruitment job fair events and stuff is great. If you're professional, there's local networking events all the time. I used to think they were super cheesy.
Yeah.
Like I used to think it was for real estate agents that don't sell real estate. Like that's always been the quote that I kind of call those networking events. But, you know, I started going to them and I've met some of my best friends and people I really respect in the business world from it. So huge.
Get out. You know, they say, you know, half the battle is showing up.
100%.
So
anyways, thank you so much, Jonathan. This was awesome. That's the pod.
thanks.
I'm Meta